They say eyes can't lie. But when my neighbor looked at me that night, hers said everything her lips refused to. The night was warmer than most, the kind of evening where the air feels soft against your skin and every sound carries just a little further. I'd stepped out onto my porch without much thought. Maybe to feel the breeze, maybe to shake off the quiet restlessness that comes when the world feels too still. That's when I saw her. She was standing by her garden fence, the pale glow of the porch light casting a soft circle around her. My neighbor, a woman I had exchanged polite nods and short greetings with in passing. But tonight, there was something different about the way she looked at me. Her eyes widened, and before she could stop herself, I heard her voice drift across the short distance between us. "I can't believe you're here." Her words weren't just surprise. There was something else buried in them, something tender, almost fragile, as though she had been thinking of me before I even appeared. I took a step closer, drawn not by choice but by instinct, and I answered in the only way that felt true. "You invited me with your eyes." She froze for a moment, and then her lips parted slightly, caught between a laugh and silence. A faint blush rose on her cheeks, even under the soft night light, and she turned her gaze toward the flowers she'd been tending. But her hands gave her away, restless, nervous, brushing over the leaves without really seeing them. I leaned against the fence, close enough to catch the faint scent of jasmine drifting from her garden. The fragrance mingled with the warm night air, making the moment feel both ordinary and impossible all at once. She glanced back at me quickly, as if to check if I was still there, and our eyes caught again. This time, neither of us looked away. It struck me then how long she had probably lived behind that fence, a life separate yet so close to mine, and how many moments like this had slipped past, unnoticed, because we had never paused long enough to let them happen. She gave a small, almost shy smile, and I could hear the unspoken words in it. "You shouldn't be here, and yet I'm glad you are." The crickets sang in the background, steady and rhythmic, like a soundtrack laid beneath the stillness. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then went silent. Every detail of the night seemed sharper, as though the world itself wanted to remember this moment with us. I didn't move closer, not yet, but the space between us felt charged, like a thread stretched tight, waiting for the smallest touch to set everything in motion. And standing there on opposite sides of the fence, I realized something simple and undeniable. Sometimes it isn't words or invitations that bring two people together. Sometimes it's just the quiet pull of eyes meeting across the dark, and the courage to step into what those eyes are already saying. I linger by the fence, not entirely sure whether I should step closer or give her space. But something in her posture told me she didn't want me to leave. Her shoulders were tense, yet her eyes kept drifting back toward me, betraying a pull she was trying to hide. The wooden fence between us wasn't tall, just chest high, but in that moment it felt like more than planks of cedar. It felt like a line neither of us had planned to cross, the kind of boundary neighbors keep polite and safe. Yet tonight, I found myself leaning against it, my arm resting casually along the top, closing the gap in a way I never had before. She bent slightly, fussing with the flowers that grew wild at the edge of her garden. At first, I thought she was genuinely occupied, but I soon realized it was a distraction. Her hands moved quickly, brushing leaves, straightening stems that needed no straightening. Every few seconds, her gaze flickered up at me, quick, almost guilty, before darting away again. I noticed a small white blossom had fallen from its stem, caught awkwardly in the dirt by her shoe. Without thinking, I reached over the fence and picked it up, shaking off the soil. When I held it out to her, my hand extended into her space. The gesture felt far more intimate than it should have. For a second, she hesitated. Her fingers hovered just above mine, trembling slightly, before finally taking the flower. The moment stretched. Her hand brushed against my knuckles, light, accidental, but deliberate enough to linger longer than necessary. A warmth rushed through me at the contact, subtle but undeniable, like sparks quietly threading into the night. She cleared her throat softly, as though to remind herself of her composure. "It's just a flower," she murmured, her voice low, almost defensive. "Maybe," I replied with a small smile, "but it suits you." The way she blinked at me told me she hadn't expected that answer. For the first time that night, she didn't look away. Her lips parted slightly, as though searching for something to say, but finding nothing that could match the weight of the silence between us. The porch light above her flickered faintly, casting shifting shadows across her face. The light caught the fine lines near her eyes, but it only made her expression more graceful, more human. She looked real, not polished, not distant, but standing there with me in the warm, imperfect night. I shifted closer along the fence, just enough that our shoulders nearly aligned. I could feel her presence, radiating warmth even without touching. It struck me how strange and beautiful it was, this ordinary setting, a fence, a flower, a quiet night, becoming the stage for something neither of us had expected. The invisible line between us hadn't disappeared, but it had thinned. With a glance, a touch, and a flower pass from one hand to another, we had both stepped across it, without moving our feet at all. We didn't need to agree on it. Somehow, without words, we both ended up sitting on the low stone steps at the edge of her garden. The night air pressed gently against us, carrying the damp, earthy scent of wet soil after the sprinklers had shut off. It was the kind of silence that should have felt awkward, but instead it wrapped around us like a fragile thread, something to be protected rather than broken. She sat close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her shoulder. Not touching, not leaning, just present, and yet her nearness tugged at my awareness with every passing second. I could hear the faint rhythm of her breathing. Inhale, exhale, slower than before, steadier, as though my presence had calmed her. Or maybe she was trying to calm herself. Her eyes were fixed on the ground in front of us, but I could sense her thoughts racing. Every so often, she shifted slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear or tracing her fingertips along the edge of the stone step. Little gestures that betrayed nerves she wouldn't voice aloud. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, but something inside told me the silence was already speaking for her. Our knees brushed once. Accidental, a small collision born of shifting positions. I expected her to move away, but she didn't. Instead, her leg stayed where it was, pressed lightly against mine. It was the kind of touch that could have been dismissed as nothing, but we both knew better. That single point of contact hummed louder than any confession could. The porch light above flickered again, casting us into a brief pocket of darkness before sputtering back to life. For that second of shadow, I felt the intimacy grow sharper, like the world had momentarily hidden us away, giving permission to be closer. She drew in a breath, soft and shaky, and I knew she felt it too. I wanted to speak, to tell her how I noticed the way she always lingered a little longer outside when I returned home, or how her laugh from across the fence could make even the dullest evening feel lighter. But no words came. Instead, I let the silence carry the weight of those unspoken truths. She finally turned her face toward me. Not fully, just enough that I could see her profile, the graceful curve of her jaw, the faint crease of worry at her brow, the delicate softness around her mouth. Her eyes flicked up and caught mine. For the first time that evening, neither of us looked away. In that stillness, something shifted. The distance between us was no longer measured in steps or fences. It was measured in breaths, in glances, in the steady closeness of two people realizing they had already crossed further than either had intended. And though not a single word was spoken, the silence between us confessed everything, that she saw me, that I saw her, and that neither of us wanted to pull away. The night had stretched into something fragile and endless, the kind of moment you fear will shatter if you speak too soon. But silence can only hold so much, and eventually it broke. Not with laughter, not with small talk, but with something heavier, something real. Her voice was low, almost uncertain, when she finally spoke. I don't know why, but when you're here, I feel like I exist again. The words tumbled out as though she hadn't meant to release them. Her eyes stayed fixed on the garden in front of us, refusing to meet mine, as though afraid of what my reaction might be. I could hear the tremor in her voice, the vulnerability she so carefully kept hidden from the world slipping through in the dark. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I studied the way her hands fidgeted in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening, betraying the storm she was trying to contain. And then, quietly, I let instinct guide me. I reached over and laid my hand on top of hers. The contact was simple, yet it carried more weight than words ever could. At first, she stiffened. Her breath caught. Her body tensed as though preparing to retreat. But then, slowly, she let out a long exhale. Her fingers relaxed beneath mine, and to my surprise, she turned her palm upward and wove her hand gently into my grasp. That single gesture silenced the doubts that had been circling in my mind. Her touch wasn't casual. It was deliberate, steady, a silent plea for me not to pull away. Finally, she turned her face toward me. Her eyes shimmered in the dim porch light, not with tears, but with the sharp brightness of someone standing too close to the edge of what they've been holding in for too long. "I've spent years being invisible," she confessed, her words trembling yet sure. "I walk through my days, I smile. I play the part people expect, but no one really sees me. And then you—" She faltered, her lips pressing together as though she had gone too far. I squeezed her hand gently, grounding her, urging her silently to continue. "And then you show up," she whispered, "and suddenly I noticed, like I'm not just a shadow in my own life." The admission hung between us, raw and unpolished. I could feel the weight of her honesty pressing against me, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. But maybe a response wasn't needed. Maybe all she wanted was someone to sit beside her, to hold her hand, and to listen without judgment. I leaned closer, not too close, just enough so she could hear the steadiness in my voice. "I see you," I said softly. "I've always seen you." The words seemed to catch her off guard. Her lips parted, her expression softened, and I felt the faintest tremor in her fingers as they tightened around mine. In that instant, something shifted between us. She wasn't the untouchable neighbor behind the garden fence anymore. She was a woman, vulnerable, searching, quietly yearning, and she had chosen to let me glimpse the part of her she hid from the rest of the world. And as her hand remained in mine, warm and steady, I realized that this wasn't just the first honest words between us. It was the beginning of a truth neither of us could keep buried much longer. The night deepened, the air cooling in a way that made the warmth between us even more noticeable. For a long while, we stayed as we were, our hands still linked on the stone step, neither of us daring to let go. It was as though that one point of contact was the only proof this moment was real, a tether binding us quietly in the dark. Then I noticed her shiver, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. Her shoulders lifted slightly, her body folding inward for warmth. Without thinking, I slipped off my jacket and held it out. She glanced at it, then at me, hesitation flickering across her face. "I'm fine," she said, though the goosebumps on her arms betrayed her. I offered a faint smile. "You don't have to be." Something softened in her expression, and after a moment, she accepted. She pulled the jacket around her shoulders, the fabric draping over her gracefully. When she exhaled, it wasn't just relief from the chill. It was as if she'd allowed herself to be cared for, just for once. She leaned back slightly, adjusting the collar, and in that motion her shoulder brushed against mine. It was the lightest touch, but neither of us moved away. Instead, we remained there, the silence humming with the awareness of closeness. I could feel the faint warmth of her through the fabric, her presence more tangible than the night air around us. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was low, softened by something more than gratitude. I turned my head, studying her face. The moonlight caught her features, illuminating the delicate lines around her eyes and the quiet strength in her expression. She wasn't trying to hide behind composure now. She looked real, human, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with being wholly herself. "You make it too easy," I replied before I could stop myself. Her brow lifted slightly, curious. "Make what easy?" "Caring about you," I said, the words slipping out more vulnerable than I intended. For a heartbeat, she froze. Then, as if surrendering to something she'd been holding back, she tilted her head and let out a small, unsteady laugh. Not mocking, but surprised, the kind of laugh that belongs to someone who hasn't been spoken to like that in a very long time. Her hand rose instinctively to adjust the jacket, and as she did, a strand of hair fell across her face. Before I thought better of it, I reached out. My fingers brushed against her temple as I tucked the strand gently behind her ear. The contact lasted no longer than a second, but in that second, everything changed. Her eyes fluttered shut, as though she had to close herself off from the intensity of it. When they opened again, they met mine directly, and the silence that followed carried a weight neither of us could escape. There was no kiss, no dramatic confession, just the shared warmth of shoulders pressed together under one jacket, and the electricity of a touch so simple, yet so full of unspoken promise, that it left the air trembling around us. And in that closeness, I realized, temptation isn't always loud or reckless. Sometimes, it's the quiet pull of a moment that feels too right to ignore and too dangerous to fully embrace. The world around us seemed to narrow. It was no longer the garden, the fence, or the quiet street beyond. It was just the two of us, shoulder to shoulder beneath the dim porch light, bound together by a silence that had grown too heavy to ignore. Her laughter from moments earlier had faded, leaving behind a quiet tremor in the air. She turned her face toward me, slow and deliberate, and suddenly the distance between us was measured not in steps or fences, but in inches. I could see her clearly now, the faint curve of her smile, the steady rise and fall of her breath, the delicate lines around her eyes that spoke of years lived, battles endured, and strength carried with grace. I swallowed, trying to steady myself, but the pull was undeniable. Every instinct in me leaned forward, urging me closer, and I saw the same hesitation mirrored in her. Her gaze flicked down toward my lips for the briefest second before darting back to my eyes, as though she had betrayed something she couldn't take back. "This isn't supposed to happen," she whispered. Her voice was thin, fragile, like a secret carried on the wind. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her she was wrong. Instead, I leaned closer, closing the space until I could feel the warmth of her breath brushing softly against my skin. My forehead came to rest against hers, and in that small act, every unspoken desire, every hidden longing, found a place to exist. We stayed there, suspended in a moment that felt infinite. My hand lifted, almost of its own accord, and hovered just above her cheek. I didn't touch her, not fully, just let the back of my fingers graze lightly against her jawline, enough to send a ripple through the air between us. Her eyes fluttered shut, her lips parting slightly as though she were caught between resistance and surrender. The night had gone still. Even the crickets, once a constant chorus, seemed to have fallen silent, leaving behind a silence that pressed against us like a heartbeat. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my chest, and I wondered if she could hear it too. For one endless moment, I considered closing the final inch, letting the tension snap, giving in to what had been building since that first glance across the fence. But then I caught the faint tremor in her breath, the vulnerability in the way she clutched my jacket tighter around her shoulders, and I knew. This wasn't about what either of us wanted in a rush. It was about what we were afraid of losing if we went too far, too soon. So I didn't kiss her. Instead, I stayed there, forehead to forehead, breathing with her, letting the closeness itself be enough. My restraint was not rejection. It was a promise that there would be more, but only when she was ready. Her eyes opened slowly, meeting mine with a softness that made my chest ache. For once, she didn't hide. She let me see everything, the longing, the fear, the quiet hope she had buried for so long. And in that gaze, in that almost kiss that lingered between us, I realized something profound. Sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones where lips meet, but the ones where they almost do, where desire breathes just close enough to be felt, but not claimed. The moment stretched, fragile as glass, as we sat there with our foreheads touching, breaths mingling in the night air. Neither of us moved to break it, but neither of us dared to go further. It was as though we had both stepped to the edge of something vast and uncharted, and we were holding on, afraid of what the next step might mean. Then, slowly she pulled back. Not far, just enough to look at me properly. The porch light above cast a soft glow over her face, illuminating the quiet conflict in her eyes. I thought she might retreat completely, retreat into the safer distance of neighborly politeness, but instead, she smiled. It wasn't a practiced smile, not the kind she wore during the day when she greeted the mailman or waved at passersby. This was smaller, gentler, touched with something vulnerable. It was the smile of someone who had just allowed herself to be seen, and who wasn't ashamed of it. Her hand rose, tentative, and came to rest against my chest. Light, barely there, but enough for her to feel the steady rhythm of my heartbeat beneath her palm. Her fingers spread slightly, as though she needed proof of my presence, as though she wanted to anchor herself in the reality of what had just passed between us. "You should go," she said softly. The words carried no authority, no finality. They were spoken more like a question, more like a request she didn't truly mean. I searched her eyes, reading the contradiction she hadn't put into words. Her voice asked me to leave, but her hand, still resting against my chest, still lingering, told me she wasn't ready to let go. "I know," I murmured, "but I don't want to." For a heartbeat, her expression wavered. She bit her lip, torn between caution and desire, between the world she lived in and the moment she wanted to hold on to. Then almost reluctantly, she squeezed my hand just once, firm, decisive. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the weight of everything left unsaid. A thank you, a promise, a plea not to vanish after tonight. When I finally stood, the loss of her touch felt sharper than I expected. Yet there was no bitterness in it, only the quiet certainty that what had happened between us was not fleeting. It was the beginning of something neither of us had planned, but both of us had longed for in silence. As I stepped back toward my own porch, I glanced over my shoulder. She was still there, standing in the soft circle of light, my jacket wrapped around her shoulders like a secret only we shared. She didn't call out, but her eyes followed me, steady, luminous, and filled with something unspoken but undeniable. The night swallowed the distance between us, but it no longer felt like a separation. It felt like a bridge, fragile, untested but real. And as I closed my door behind me, my heart was still racing with the knowledge that this was not an ending. It was the first chapter of something waiting to be written, quietly, tenderly, between two people who had finally allowed themselves to be seen. If this story touched you, don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps me keep bringing you heartfelt, age-gap romance stories like this one. And if you'd love to join me for the next chapter of Slow Burn Love, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a moment.